Discover Geography, Lesson 4-3, Migration. In our previous lessons, we've been focusing on the first two aspects of the population equation, births and deaths. In this lesson, we'll look at immigration and emigration as factors that can shape a country's population. We'll be focusing in this case on international migration for the sake of simplicity, but many of the ideas that we talk about in this lesson can be applied to internal migration as well, migration between places within a given country. And you see on the map here the countries of origin of people living in the United States in the year 2000. So you can see that some countries send a lot of people to the United States, whereas other countries, which may even have very large populations, have much fewer of their people that have come to the United States. Likewise, if we looked at a map of where people from the United States have moved to, we'd see some countries taking in a large number of migrants from the United States, other countries taking in much fewer. If we want to understand why people move from one particular country to another, we can look at what we call push and pull factors. A push factor is something that makes you want to leave the country that you're starting in. So something that makes that country less desirable to live in so that you want to go somewhere else. So that could be economic troubles, you can't find a job, can't support yourself. It could be environmental catastrophe. It could be violence that you're fleeing. It could be oppression by the government of the country. So that's what makes you want to leave the country where you're starting. So the example that you see in the photo is security services in Egypt. If they're repressing people, that would make people want to leave that country. Pull factors are the things that make you want to go to a particular destination country. So if you're leaving one country, why do you go to a particular destination country rather than another? And these are often the inverse of whatever the push factors were that were pushing you out of where you came from. So if you're leaving one country because you can't find a job there, then obviously the availability of a job is going to be an important pull factor pulling you into a particular destination country. If you're leaving one country because of political repression, then political freedom is probably going to be a big pull factor helping to determine which country you're going to head to. Now, in the process of leaving one country and going to another, you may encounter a variety of barriers that get in the way in between. So these barriers may be physical barriers, a desert or an ocean or a mountain range that makes it difficult to travel from one country to another. Or they may be human-created barriers. They could be deliberately constructed barriers. The U.S. border with Mexico, for example, has fences built along portions of it. There are checkpoints, like you see in the middle photo, where you cross at designated crossings where they'll inspect you and may turn you back if they don't think that you're crossing for the right reasons. There are also inadvertent barriers, things like cultural differences that make it hard for you to cross into a new place and get set up there. So the push factors that are driving people out of their place of origin, the pull factors that are pulling them into their new place, and the barriers that restrict their movement between one place and the other are going to shape the migration flows that we see from one country to another. And these push and pull factors may shape not only the size of that migration flow, how many people are migrating from country A to country B, but also the composition of that migration flow. Who is moving from a certain country to another country? For example, migration from Mexico to the United States has traditionally been overwhelmingly male. It's mostly men coming from Mexico to the United States, though in recent years it's evened out more. And that had to do with some of the pull factors in the United States. One of the major industries that Mexican men were coming to work in is construction. And that's an industry that is traditionally heavily male-dominated. It's not an industry that would be easy for women to break into. And so if those are the jobs that are pulling you into the country, then it's going to be a largely male immigration stream. On the other hand, migration from the Philippines tends to be more heavily dominated by women, because the particular job opportunities that have drawn people from the Philippines to the United States have been in fields like nursing that are traditionally female-dominated industries. And the Philippines is an interesting case because that has been such a big migration stream that the education system in the Philippines has actually altered their curriculum to make it match up with nursing accreditation standards in countries like the United States, Canada, or Japan that draw in large numbers of Filipinas coming to be nurses so that you can easily translate your credentials over and more easily get into a job there. So they've worked to eliminate the barrier of incompatible accreditation standards in order to facilitate that kind of migration. Now, when you arrive in a new country, you're not instantly a full member of that country's population. Depending on how you arrive and when you arrive and who you are, you may have different levels of what we call immigration status. And your immigration status determines the rights and opportunities that you have in your new country. In the next few slides, we're going to talk about some of the types of immigration status that are important in the United States. But there are parallels between this system and the systems that we see in most other countries in the world. A caveat that I'll give here is that immigration law is one of the most complex areas of law in the United States. It's usually rated second only to tax law. So what I'm giving you is a very brief summary of the different types of status, the different types of requirements for it, and the different rights and obligations that it entails. The most secure type of immigration status that you can have is to be a citizen. A citizen is a full member of the national community. A citizen has the full range of rights and responsibilities that you can have. So, for example, citizens can work in any job in the country that they're otherwise qualified for, including some of the most high security clearance jobs where anyone who's not a citizen would not be eligible for that job. Citizens are the only ones who are able to vote. Citizens are the only ones who can serve on juries in trials. To become a citizen, there are basically three routes. Two of them you would have to do when you were born. So first, if you're born on U.S. soil, you are automatically a U.S. citizen right from birth. That cannot be taken away from you. And that applies regardless of who your parents were, how recently they came to the United States, what status they had. As long as your birth occurred on U.S. soil, you are automatically a U.S. citizen from birth. Second, you could be born to parents who are U.S. citizens. So in this case, you could be born anywhere in the world, but as long as your parents are U.S. citizens, then you are automatically a U.S. citizen right from birth. And again, that can't be taken away from you. The last way to get to get citizenship in the United States, if you don't start off with it from birth, you can go through a naturalization process. This usually requires you to have acquired some other immigration status first, to have lived in the United States for a designated period of time, to have passed a number of other requirements such as learning English, passing a civics test, and then you go through a ceremony like you see in the picture there, and then you become a citizen. Once you're a naturalized citizen, you are a citizen equal to any other citizen in every respect except one. The naturalized citizen cannot, according to the Constitution, run for president. In every other way, a naturalized citizen is the same as someone who's born a citizen. And again, once you become a citizen through naturalization, that can't be taken away from you unless you voluntarily give it up in order to join a different country. The next most secure type of immigration status is what we call a legal permanent resident, or sometimes a lawful permanent resident. It refers to the same thing. An LPR is someone who has permission to stay in the United States indefinitely. There's no limit to it. There's no time period at which that expires and you get kicked out. However, you don't have the full set of rights and responsibilities that a citizen would. So you can't vote, for example. You may be excluded from certain high security clearance jobs. And you can lose your status and be deported back to your country of origin, the country that you're still a citizen of, if you commit certain crimes. And the law on which crimes in which combinations can get you deported is an extremely complex body of law. Some people are LPRs their entire life. They move to the United States and live here for decades as LPRs. If they have, for example, an emotional attachment to their country of origin, and so they don't want to give that up to become a U.S. citizen, they're willing to accept the LPR status. Many people get LPR status as a stepping stone to citizenship. So if you get to be an LPR, then you're usually going to be able then to go through the naturalization process and move up to becoming a citizen after a period of time. LPRs are the people that we were referring to if you talk about someone having a green card. Now, in this case, the LPR identity document is not actually green. It's more of an off-white color. The thing the woman is holding in the picture is something that one of her friends made for her at a party to celebrate her getting her legal permanent resident status. The actual identity document is not green anymore, but we still use that term. And that's what we're really referring to if someone talks about someone having their green card. Another type of immigration status is a refugee or asylee. These are people who are allowed to stay in the United States because they fear some kind of persecution in their home country. So this is something where we let people stay in the United States because we're worried about what's going to happen to them if they got sent home. So in the picture you see a fellow who's one of the lost boys in Sudan. They fled Sudan as a result of tribal violence there, and so they were allowed to get refugee status in the United States because if they were sent home, they would be at risk of being killed. In order to be a refugee or asylee, you have to have a reasonable fear of persecution by the government of your country. So the government itself has to be coming after you, or else the government has to be really obviously looking the other way while someone else comes after you. So they've got kind of the implicit consent of the government. So if you're just afraid of a natural disaster that hit your country, or there's gang violence that the government is doing its best to stop but just hasn't succeeded yet, that doesn't count. It has to be the government going after you. And they have to be targeting you in particular on the basis of your race, your religion, your nationality, your membership in a particular social group. And so that's been used for things like gays and lesbians in countries where they have the death penalty or other severe punishment for homosexuality, or for your political opinion. So it's something about you, right? Some important characteristic of you, something that you can't change, like your race, or something that it would be a serious issue for you to change, like your political opinions or your religion. If you fear that kind of persecution on one of those bases, then you can get refugee or asylee status and be able to stay in the United States so that you don't get harmed by going back to your country of origin. Next, we have visas. Visas are temporary permits to come to the United States, usually for a particular purpose. And there are a whole host of different visas for different types of reasons that you might come to the United States. So the guy you see in the picture there is on a tourist visa. And so the tourist visa will have certain conditions based on what a tourist is here to do. So on a tourist visa, you can't get a job because that's not why you'd come as a tourist. There's a limited amount of time that you can spend here while you're doing your tourism. You can't go from being a tourist to getting an immigration status that lets you stay permanently, because again, that's not what you're supposed to be doing as a tourist. Other types of visas will have different requirements in terms of whether you're allowed to work and in what jobs, how long you can stay, what kind of rights you have while you're here, whether you can upgrade to a different status at the end. So in addition to tourist visas, we have things like visas for entertainers and people with unusual skills. So this guy here is Takeru Kobayashi, who is a champion hot dog eater from Japan, and he got one of these visas to come for a hot dog eating competition. There are diplomatic visas for ambassadors and their staff. There are work visas for people working in certain industries. There are student visas if you're coming here as a student. There are visas for victims of crime to allow them to stay in the United States to testify against the person that perpetrated a crime against them. There are a whole host of different visas with different requirements. The one commonality to all of them is that they are temporary. When your visa expires, you either have to get a new status, which might be a different kind of visa, might be to upgrade to LPR status, etc., or you have to go home. The last major category of immigration status is people who are undocumented. So these are the people who are not legally allowed to be in the United States. The people who the law says shouldn't be here, but they're here anyway. The undocumented population we often think of as people who snuck across the border. But in fact, that's only about half of the current undocumented population in the United States. So only about half of our current undocumented population entered the country illegally, people who should not have been allowed in the first place. The other half are people who entered legally, but should have gone home and didn't. So that's people, for example, who overstayed a visa. We often have people who will come over on a student visa, and so they'll be in school and they'll earn their degree, and then they decide they're going to stay, even though their visa has now expired now that they're done with school and they're supposed to go back to their country of origin. They then become undocumented if they overstay that visa. And those people make up the other half of our current undocumented population. There are a whole variety of effects that immigration may have on a country. So we're going to look at what some of those effects are within the United States. So one of the big effects that people talk about is economic. There's a lot of worry that immigrants are going to, quote, steal our jobs by coming to the United States. There have been a variety of studies done on this, and what they tend to show is that immigrants, especially low-wage immigrants, people coming illegally, are not competing with native-born workers for the same jobs. They're working in different industries. They're doing different sorts of jobs. So the economic impact on most native workers is actually positive. You've got more people in the country, so that means more customers for businesses. So businesses do better, can hire more people, pay them more. And especially, again, when we're dealing with immigrants who are working for very low wages, people who are undocumented and therefore can be easily exploited by their employers to pay them less, to work them more hours than they ought to be able to, products end up cheaper. So our tomatoes, like you see being picked by those folks in the picture, are cheaper because of the low-wage immigrant labor who's picking them. And so that's an economic benefit to everyone else who's buying those tomatoes. Now, if you are competing directly with immigrants for jobs, if you want to work as a tomato picker, then high levels of immigration will have a negative effect on your wages. They will drive down wages in those industries because employers would rather hire people who are willing to work for less money or who they can get away with paying less, because if those people are undocumented, then they're not going to want to get police attention by complaining about not being paid what they were owed, because then they could get deported too. So overall, the economic impact of immigration on the United States is a small positive impact. Immigration also has a significant economic impact on the sender countries, because immigrants, especially who are coming from a very poor country to a richer country, will send money back home to their friends and family in the country they came from. This money that's sent home by immigrants is known as remittances. And remittances are a major source of foreign income for many poor countries. And what you see on that graph is the amount of remittances going from the United States to Mexico over the course of the 90s into the 2000s. And you can see how many millions of dollars that added up to. Remittances can be larger for many poor countries than the amount of money they receive in official foreign aid from governments, larger than the income they receive from charity efforts, and larger than the income they receive from their own exports, the products that they produce and sell abroad. Mexico, for example, has remittances as its number 2 source of foreign income, second only to oil. Anything else that Mexico is producing and exporting earns less money than remittances from Mexicans living abroad, mostly in the United States and Canada, that are being sent back to their friends and family in Mexico. Immigration's effects on government budgets also tend to be slightly positive. Overall, immigrants pay more money into the system in taxes than they take out in government services and other spending. So immigrants are often not eligible for a lot of government spending programs, a lot of programs that would pay out to people you can't get if you're an immigrant, if you are not a citizen. And yet immigrants will pay all of the same taxes as citizens do. This is obvious in the case of something like sales tax. You can't go to a store and say, oh, don't charge me sales tax, I'm an immigrant. Immigrants, even undocumented immigrants, are going to have to pay that sales tax. They're going to have to pay property taxes. They're going to have to pay a whole variety of these kind of taxes, and they'll even pay income taxes. Obviously, if you're here legally, you're going to pay income taxes on your wages or salary, just like anyone else. And even undocumented people will typically file their income taxes because in all of the immigration reform bills that have been introduced in Congress in the last couple decades, one of the requirements that's always in there when there are proposals to give some sort of path to legalization for undocumented people is always that you'd have to pay your back taxes, the taxes you would have owed if you'd been working legally. And because that requirement is always in these bills, even though these bills have yet to pass Congress, a large number of even undocumented immigrants will pay their income taxes, pay their Social Security and Medicare taxes now in the hopes that having a record of having paid those taxes will make it easier for them to gain status if one of these bills ever were to pass. So immigrants are paying a huge amount of taxes into the system, but they're not claiming as much back in services and other spending from the government as native workers. So they tend to have overall a net positive effect on government budgets. There's also often a lot of worry about the social effects of immigration, things about disruption of society and crime. In this case, we have good data to show that immigrants actually commit fewer crimes than native workers. So what you see on that graph is the one represents first generation. Those are the people who actually immigrated, who crossed the border from another country. You can see their percentage who have been arrested and then the percentage who have ever been incarcerated, so actually convicted of something and put in jail. The two represents the second generation, the children of the people that crossed the border, and then the last bar represents everyone from the grandchildren of immigrants on out to people who have been here since the Mayflower or before. And so what you see is immigrants commit a lot fewer crimes than people who have been here for longer. And that makes a certain kind of sense. The kind of people who would have the ambition and drive to actually move from one country to another, which is not an easy thing to do, are also going to be the kind of people who are going to want to work hard and keep their head down while they're here in their new country. They're not going to want to attract attention to themselves, especially if they're undocumented and are at a really high risk of deportation. Over time, though, as their descendants assimilate to the mainstream of society, their typical crime rates also assimilate and they start committing crimes at higher rates. On the other hand, immigrants are more likely to be victims of crimes than native people. Immigrants can often be exploited by employers and by other people who know that because their status is fragile, because they're worried about getting sent home, they're not likely to make a big fuss about it. They're not likely to try to report what happened to them and cooperate in a police investigation because they don't want to attract attention to themselves. And so criminals often target immigrants for various types of crimes. Immigration also has cultural effects. When immigrants are coming from a very different cultural background than the native people of the country they're coming into, it can lead to cultural shifts within the country. And so you see there a picture saying this finger wasn't made to press 1 for English. We can see some of the cultural effects of high levels of immigration from Mexico and other parts of Latin America in the United States with the increasing acceptance of Spanish as a language in which to do business. And so this is upsetting to a lot of native-born people. They don't want to have their culture change. They don't want their country to change in that way. It usually takes about 3 generations for immigrants to assimilate into what has become now the mainstream culture of the country they're moving to. So often what you see is that for the first generation of immigrants coming from Mexico to the United States, for example, they'll mostly speak Spanish. They may learn English, but they're not as comfortable in it, they're not as fluent in it, and they prefer to speak Spanish. Their children, the second generation, will be fully bilingual. They're able to speak English fluently to their friends who are native-born, and they're able to speak Spanish fluently to their parents and older generations. The third generation will primarily speak English. They'll be fluent in English, and they'll have difficulty or not learn Spanish. So it takes generally about 3 generations to assimilate. And that's been the case throughout the immigration history of the United States. It took about 3 generations for Italian immigrants in the late 1800s, early 1900s to assimilate. It took about 3 generations for German immigrants in the mid-1800s to assimilate, etc. That's just a typical sociological phenomenon. Last, we can ask about environmental effects. What you see in the picture there is some trash that was left behind at a campsite where people who were sneaking across the US border from Mexico hung out during the day to try to avoid notice from Border Patrol. So there's some acute environmental effects right along the border if you have a high number of people coming in, especially a high number of people coming in illegally, therefore sneaking through natural areas rather than crossing through designated checkpoints. You also have concerns about the environmental impacts once people are in the United States. So if people in the United States have a lifestyle that's bad for the environment, that generates a high environmental impact, uses up a lot of resources, generates a lot of waste, if immigrants come here and assimilate to that way of life, then their environmental impact is going to increase by quite a lot. Unfortunately, we don't have really good, clear quantification of exactly how much environmental impact immigration really has, but it is a concern that is out there.